So today is the first week of a sermon series that we're going to be doing on the theme of justice from a biblical perspective. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we're choosing to do this series right now. So I think we probably all agree that justice and questions about justice are at the forefront of our national life right now. They're kind of at the forefront of our national discussions and our national disagreements, sometimes bitter disagreements. And I think 2014, if you can remember back then, seems like a lifetime ago, but in 2014, Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. And his death led to the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this movement came to a head with the murder of George Floyd. And that event spurred protests first in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but then pretty amazingly, these protests started popping up all over the world. And I think that tells us that this issue of racial injustice is a really potent one worldwide. The killing of George Floyd and the brutality of that death that I think many of us probably witnessed in that recording, it sparked some soul searching in the United States, and particularly for some white Americans. Because once we started thinking about the history of racial injustice in our country, you start to realize that it is not difficult to trace a very clear line from the beginning of our country's history, right, with the brutality and injustice of slavery through hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way up to George Floyd's death. And right now, we seem to be grappling with how to understand our history, how to see ourselves as Americans. We're in the middle of what feels like a national identity crisis in some ways. Now, there have been other justice movements in the last few years, and another one that comes to mind right away is the Me Too movement. And that began in 2017, and that was and is focused on sexism and sexual abuse and harassment of women. And that movement, too, has kind of picked up pace throughout the world. But I want to jump back to George Floyd. And in the wake of those protests, the organization that Brian and Delean Ward work with, called NOVO, they initiated something called the Beyond Words movement. And it kicked off with events in various cities throughout the United States, where white clergy members would gather together to repent of our indifference and the white church's indifference to racial injustice. And at that event, we were invited to sign commitment cards where we committed to working for racial justice in our capacity as clergy members. And one of those commitments was to preach about racial justice. Now, the series that we're beginning today is not exclusively about racial justice. We're looking at the broader question of what our tradition's scriptures have to say about this topic in general. And our assumption is that what the Bible has to say about God's justice applies to the narrower topic of racial justice. So all that to say, we're undertaking this series because our country, including our churches, are struggling with these questions right now. And it just so happens that our tradition and our scriptures have a lot to say about this topic. One problem with tackling a topic like this is that I don't know if you could talk to somebody or find somebody who did not care about the issue of justice, right? It's kind of a universal concern. But it means very, very different things to different people. So we don't have a universal definition of what justice is. So at the protest this summer, we saw signs, some of us probably carried signs with statements about justice, like this one. We heard and joined chants using that word, and yet each person has different assumptions about what justice looks like. You can have people on opposite sides of a protest yelling justice at each other, right? Talking past each other, yelling past each other, really. So it's a really complicated topic. So I think it might help us to think about what goes involved, or what elements are involved in this notion of justice. And there are a few factors at work. And if you are interested, the information I'm going to be referencing in the next few slides, it's from a book called The Little Book of Biblical Justice, and it's by Chris Marshall. And according to him, there are 4 main ingredients when we talk about justice. So bear with me for a moment here. This might feel a little bit academic, but I think it will help us consider this concept in a more analytical way. So the first ingredient is, distribution. Meaning that justice involves the appropriate distribution of social benefits, right? People should get their fair share of society's goods and rewards. And also, people should not be punished for things that they don't deserve. There is the question of power. So injustice happens when power is misused to deny people of something that they are rightfully due. Then there's the concept of equity, which basically means fairness, balance. So similar things should be treated as similars, and conflicts between people and groups should be dealt with even-handedly and as objectively as possible. And then the final element is rights. People's rights should be honored. So he comes up with this definition here where he tries to weave together those elements. So justice entails the exercise of legitimate power to ensure that benefits and penalties are distributed fairly and equitably in society, thus meeting the rights and enforcing the obligation of all parties. Now, if you spend 30 seconds thinking about this definition, you're going to realize pretty quickly that it brings up more questions than answers. So how do you decide who should have power, or what kind of power they should have? What makes power legitimate or illegitimate? But it's a starting point. So that's kind of a technical description of what factors are involved. And you probably noticed that is not that's sort of a dry, secular understanding of justice. But I want to shift to scripture because the purpose of this series is not to offer a secular understanding that everybody can agree to. We are interested in seeing what the Christian tradition tells us. And this might be surprising, but a good place to start with the Christian conception of justice is the very beginning of the Bible. And that's the story of the creation of the world. I'm forgetting the name of the painter of this painting. He did hundreds of versions of what he called the peaceable kingdom. I think Edward Hicks, maybe. But I don't think we normally think about the creation narrative as a story about justice. But really, our attempts to do justice are actually attempts at restoring God's intention for the world. I think we all know the story pretty well, so I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'll give a summary. In the beginning, God created the world. And one of the major emphases of this creation story is balance. God creates light, God creates darkness, God creates day and night. God separates the waters from the dry land. He separates the face of the earth from the surrounding chaos of the universe. And this is what the writer means when he writes that God creates a dome in the sky to separate the waters below from the waters above. It was believed that space was made up of water, which was a symbol for chaos in the ancient world. And of course, God creates life, plants, animals, sea creatures, and God places them all in their appropriate habitats. And all of it is declared good. And it is good because it is orderly and it's harmonious. And this goodness, although the writer does not use this word, this goodness is essentially shalom. All things in the world are as they should be. Everything is in balance. And really what that means is the relationships between things and between all life. These relationships are good and balanced and mutually edifying, I guess you could say. And finally, of course, God creates humanity. God creates us, people. And in this story in Genesis, humanity has a very special purpose. God says, you are going to be caretakers of my creation, essentially. I am giving you this responsibility. I'm giving you this role. I have made you in my image. You are uniquely created to function as an icon of myself in the rest of creation, here in the world. And because you are uniquely similar to me, you are tasked with maintaining shalom, the shalom of creation. This is what it means when God says people will have dominion over the earth. That is essentially the role of a caretaker. And this is humanity's calling and humanity's purpose, to be icons of God in creation. We are uniquely designed to pay attention and to care for the goodness of creation, and to do justice. And I think this is a really important place to begin our series on justice, by recognizing the goodness of God's creation, and the shalom that is meant to be throughout creation. And this was not by any means a universal belief among ancient peoples. Other ancient creation stories involve violence and conflict. People are not seen as partners of the Creator. People were seen as subjects or slaves to be dominated and manipulated by the gods, right? They are the adversaries of the gods. But the ancient Israelite version is profoundly different from that. Creation is dignified. Goodness and shalom are at the heart of creation and the world. And essentially, in this part of the story of creation, not only are all the relationships between life forms on earth in harmony and good, but humanity's relationship with God is balanced and where it's supposed to be. And so again, in the Israelite version, people have dignity. People matter. God has granted us a special place and a special role as representatives and reflections of the Creator and the Creator's character. That's where I'm going to end today. But I would encourage us to think about this over the next week, to think about humanity's special relationship to God when you think about creation, and God's unique calling for us as people, right, to be maintainers of God's goodness and God's shalom in creation. And we'll get to a little more drama next week, I think. Any questions or comments?
think it's interesting how a lot of times it feels like we're preserving creation in a sense can sometimes lead to greater injustices and all.
Yeah.
I just think that's kind of, I don't know, interesting.
Yeah, it's like,
I mean, I think of like, you know, metals and materials that are mined to create, you know, a lot of renewable energies, but how are the conditions at those
right.
places? I think it's just interesting when we talk about, yeah, like how those really should be tied together, creation, care, and our life and justice. But it does feel like, I think that this scarcity mentality of like there's not enough for everyone.
Right.
Kind of things.
Yeah, and it's just so deeply ironic
Yeah.
that people seem to be doing damage.
Can you put the definition back up?
Yeah.
I'm sure that benefits and penalties, I was just thinking in terms of, I don't think in terms of penalties.
Yeah.
Then I was thinking, for some reason that made me think of the, you know, the rich, you know, you hear about billionaires who paid zero taxes last year, and I go, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
Like they didn't get penalized.
Right.
I did.
Yeah.
They didn't get penalized. I don't know, that just was a weird thought. I always think about the benefits side, people getting the benefits
Right.
they should get, not the other side. So that was just.
Yeah, and so, you know, in this book that I referenced, he also talks about, you know, there are questions about social justice, but then criminal justice is a whole different side of justice. And criminal justice is about punishment. Here, at least, it is.
What's that?
The Little Book of Biblical Justice. It's very little.
That number 6 font.
Yeah.
Got used
I
to
don't
it.
know, have you guys ever heard of Isaiah?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, I work with them, I'm a member there.
The organization, I
And
think.
we work
Yeah.
with a lot of justice stuff, justice credibles,
Yep.
justice. We were working with this thing with George Floyd. We have a lot of meetings at our church about this kind of stuff. And that's a request that if one of our people come and talk about justice, I know a person that would be more glad to come and talk about it. We want them to.
Yeah, I'll get their name from you after the service. Thanks.
Because we've been waiting, since I've been there.
Yeah, that's a good organization.
But I didn't start Isaiah until about, I think probably about a year or two ago. I went in with Isaiah.
Yeah, nice.
But it's a real good organization. I mean, it's really interesting what we do. We work with battered women, we work with prisoners, we work with all that stuff.
Yeah,
Which I work with alcohol, not arraignment. Myself, you know, I'm a one-to-one ministry chaplain.
oh, great.
So I know a lot of it too, so.
Yeah,
But I gotta tell a real dear friend of mine over there. And I know that she is more than glad to come
yeah.
and
Let's be in touch about that. Thank you. Any other final thoughts? Disagreements?